Little David was going to see his mother for the last time. Her funeral, as bad as it was, had already been planned. She was much too young. But when David went to visit her with his aunt, something remarkable happened. David said something strange. He repeated it several times. In response, it was decided to cancel the funeral. Rose and little David were the last guests to walk past the coffin with David's deceased mother in it. The boy was too young to know what was going on, so Rose did her utmost to stay strong for him and not cry her eyes out. The sun was shining over the cemetery. Normally it would rain at this time of year, but not today. Rose took this as a sign. Her sister watched over her. She took David in her arms and walked to the coffin. She wondered how her nephew would react. David was restless. He didn't understand why everyone was crying. He looked at his mother with concern. He opened his mouth and said something to her. Rose couldn't believe what she was hearing and screamed for the undertaker. But what did David tell his mother? And why was Rose so stressed about it? Haley was a loving mother to David. They did everything together. She loved him so much that it hurt. There is a saying, "I love you so much that I would die for you." And in this case, that really happened. Her bond with David was so strong that she would do anything for him and give him anything he asked for. Every morning, Haley and David would go for a walk. David loved to go to a nearby park and swing on the swings for hours. Haley would push him, and David would giggle. He was not old enough to go to school yet, so he spent a lot of time with his mother. David's father was not in the picture. He had left Haley just before she gave birth to David. He had never tried to contact them or get to know his son. Haley hated him for it. She could never imagine her son growing up without a father. But Haley's father, Jonah, stepped in and became the best role model for his grandson. Haley would drop David off at her parents' house every Wednesday so she could have a day to herself. She never really enjoyed it because she missed David, but she knew it was good for her. She would go to the gym or spend time with her best friend, her sister Rose. Rose and Haley were 4 years apart. She was very protective of her sister because she was the oldest. Haley could see that David loved his aunt and that they had a good relationship, so she made Rose David's godmother in her will. Rose didn't know about this, but she would soon find out. Haley's death was a tragedy. She died far too early, and the whole community mourned her. Nothing like this had ever happened in her small town. It was peaceful and full of families and elderly people. But the town would remember this day forever. It was Wednesday, and Haley was getting ready to drop David off at her grandparents'. First, she packed his bag and got herself and David dressed. She had overslept that morning and was in a hurry to get everything done on time. But while Haley was making breakfast, something terrible happened. It was time for breakfast. She looked for David, but he was no longer in his play corner. She started to panic. She searched everywhere in the house, but he was nowhere to be found. Then she noticed something. She had left the door to the garden open. How is that possible? David had just learned to walk, so his legs were not very strong. He can't be far, Haley thinks, as she puts on her boots. She runs outside and starts calling David. In the worst-case scenario, David would only walk to the playground because he had to cross a very busy intersection. Haley sees David's head in the distance. Her worst fear has come true. She sprints towards him, but he has already started to cross the road. She runs as fast as she can, not looking at the passing cars. And when she had almost reached David, tragedy struck. What she feared would happen to her son had happened to her. David didn't know what was happening. His Aunt Rose had come to pick him up and take him to his grandparents. He had seen police cars and an ambulance, so he was very excited. He didn't understand why everyone was so sad around him and kept asking about his mother. Rose discovered that she was David's godmother. Why did her sister keep this a secret from her? She loved her nephew, but she never imagined that she would become a mother at this age. There was no room for David in her small apartment, but it turned out that Haley had also left her house to Rose. David was supposed to stay with his grandparents until after the funeral, so Rose would have time to move out of her apartment and move in with Haley. It was hard for Rose to adjust to this. Everything had happened so fast. She had lost her sister, become a mother, and moved out all within a few hours. The morning after the accident, Rose got a phone call. It was from an unknown number, but she answered it anyway. A man started talking from the other end. She didn't realize who it was at first, but then it clicked. It was Vincent, David's father. He had heard about the accident and wanted to claim David. This wasn't going to happen. Rose told Vincent that she was his godmother and that Haley wanted her to take care of David. But Vincent didn't agree. They argued violently, and Vincent told her to watch out because he was coming for her. Rose wasn't shocked. Vincent had never been a real father to David. This was a foregone conclusion. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. When Rose opened the door, her jaw dropped. Vincent stood across from her and stormed through the door. "Where's my son?" he said. But David was still with his grandparents. Rose wondered why Vincent wanted to see his son so badly. He had never cared about David, so why now? "Why do you suddenly care about David? You've never been a father to him in the past. You weren't even there when he was born." "But I was." Rose's emotions were too much for her. She screamed at Vincent and started to cry. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "David doesn't even know you. You've never even paid child support or visited him once." Rose's voice broke. She couldn't bear to argue about this now. This was the worst timing ever. She needed to be alone and grieve for her sister, so she could be a positive influence on David when he came back home. She asked Vincent to go home and let her rest until after the funeral. But this wasn't over yet. She went to her grandparents' house the next day to tell them what had happened, but she heard a familiar voice as she entered the house. Vincent had gotten there before her and was sitting on the couch in the living room. David was playing for him and smiled when he saw his aunt. He ran over to her and gave her a big hug. "What are you doing here?" Rose asked Vincent as kindly as she could. She didn't want to upset David. Vincent told her the story he had told her parents. But much of it wasn't true. He claimed that Haley had kicked him out of the house and kept David away from him, but it was all lies. Rose was filled with emotion. Her voice was shaking. "How could you lie to my parents like that?" Rose tried her best to explain everything to her parents, but Vincent kept interrupting her. He denied his accusations, but her parents knew better. They had never trusted Vincent, so why would they now? They kicked Vincent out of their house and told him not to come back. But Vincent was persistent. He wouldn't give up that easily. Rose had to be careful. She called the funeral director and explained what Vincent looked like. The last thing she wanted was Vincent to disrupt the funeral. "The funeral is in 3 days. After that, David will be her responsibility." This scared Rose. She hoped that her motherly instincts would kick in and she would just know what to do. But she wasn't sure. So she decided to go through her deceased sister's things. Maybe she could find her sister's diary. She knew it wasn't ethical to read her sister's diary, but she saw it as research. She hoped Haley would describe how she disciplined David, or something that would help her raise the boy. Rose found a little red book and opened it. This is it. She started reading and cried. She missed her sister. Haley wrote about the good times she and her sister had, and how perfect her son is. She also wrote about Vincent, how he never called her back and never even sent a greeting card to his son. If he didn't want anything to do with his son, then why would he now? Rose finds this change in behavior strange. She wonders if Vincent had an ulterior motive. Maybe he wanted money from the government or help around the house. But that would never happen. Not while Rose was in charge of David. The next day she went to the police station. She thought it was wise. But the officers told her she needed proof. All she had now were accusations. But that wouldn't last long, because Vincent was at her door when she returned. She invited him in. She told him that she had been to the police station today to inform them of his latest actions. Vincent turned pale when he heard the words, "police station." Rose frowned and asked him about it, but he stood up and left in a hurry, without saying a word, as he walked out the door. Rose hoped that was the last she saw of him. But not a minute later, the doorbell rang again. Back again? Rose couldn't finish her sentence because it wasn't Vincent who was standing at her door. It was a police officer. They had investigated Vincent and found some disturbing information about him. It turned out that he was driving the same car that hit her sister in that freak accident. Rose couldn't believe what she was hearing. How is it possible that Haley and David never spoke to each other, and that he was the one who hit her with his car? The police officer continues. They had been looking for the owner of the car, but failed. And now that they know who the car belongs to, they ask Rose to help them catch Vincent. She agreed, but told them that she had told Vincent about her visit to the station and doubted that he would ever come back. They came up with a plan. It was possible that Vincent felt guilty and would show up at the funeral to pay his respects. If that was the case, the police would be notified immediately. Rose told the undertaker and her parents the plan, so that everyone knew what was going to happen. The funeral was tomorrow, and Rose hated this day. She couldn't believe that all of this was happening at the same time. But tomorrow, it would all end. It was the morning of the funeral, and Rose felt sick to her stomach. She wanted this day to be over quickly, but she also wanted to be there for the funeral and say goodbye to her sister. She met her grandparents at the crematorium and took David in her arms. They would start the ceremony with a few words about her sister. It was a small ceremony. Rose and her parents said a few words about Haley, what a good mother she was to David, and how she had left this world far too soon. Rose was on guard most of the time. She looked around to see if Vincent had decided to show up. But he wasn't at the ceremony. Maybe he would come to say goodbye at her coffin. After the ceremony, there was time to say goodbye. Everyone formed a line and could walk up to the coffin to say something. It was an open coffin, and Haley looked peaceful. Suddenly, Rose sees two police officers walking through the room. She wondered if the undertaker had called them because he had seen Vincent in the building. But Rose decided to let it go and focus on herself and David. This was an important moment for him to find closure. It would also be the first and last time he would see his mother again. David was too young to know what was going on, so Rose tried her best to stay strong for him and not cry her eyes out. She wondered how her nephew would react. David was restless. He didn't understand why everyone was crying. He looked at Rose, and she smiled at him to comfort him. Rose and David were the last guests to walk past the coffin with David's deceased mother in it. He looked down at her with concern in his eyes. "Is Mommy asleep?" he asked Rose. "Yes," she replied, not knowing what to say. She noticed David had a strange look on his face. He mumbled something that Rose couldn't hear, and became frustrated when she didn't do anything. He tried to wriggle out of her arms, but Rose stepped away from the coffin and set him down on the floor. David started to cry. He tried to lift himself onto the edge of the coffin to look over the coffin at his mother. So Rose picked him up again. She looked around to see if anyone could help her, but there was no one in the room. She calmed David down and asked him what he was saying. This time Rose understood him and informed the undertaker of David's findings. She knew she couldn't go through with the funeral if this wasn't sorted out. Rose assured David that they would look into it, and that all they could do now was wait. David calmed down, and they waited outside. The sun was shining over the cemetery. Normally it would be raining at this time of year, but not today. Rose took this as a sign. Her sister was watching over her. A tear rolled down her cheek, and David wiped it away. She looked at him and suddenly felt that everything was going to be okay. The undertaker walked out and told her that the matter had been resolved. She walked in with David in her arms and looked at her sister. She looked complete now. Rose couldn't believe that David would notice such a small detail about his mother. It showed how much he loved her. David noticed that Haley wasn't wearing her necklace with her and David's initials on it. Rose had given her the necklace before David was born and had worn it every day since. But the paramedics had to take it off after her accident. Luckily for Rose, someone was able to pick it up from the hospital. The funeral went ahead, and it was a beautiful ceremony. She was cremated, but still had a memorial stone on the wall, so David had a place to visit. Rose went to her parents' house afterwards to pick up some of David's things, and suddenly thought of Vincent. She hadn't seen him all day. Her parents told her that Vincent had shown up, but the undertaker noticed and immediately notified the police. This way, the mourners were not disturbed, and the ceremony could go on without any problems. Rose was happy to hear this. They could finally put this behind them and have closure.